Morning, morning, monsters. Good to see you all. So, at the moment, I am working through um, a book called Waylander by David Gemmell. It's in my back catalogue. I've been really keen to sort of pick through Gemmell's history, mostly because there's two books of his I absolutely adore, both of which I recently reread over the last 6 months. Wayland is taking me a bit more time because I'm also reading The Rainbow's End for the book club. But my two favorites of his, the one I won't be speaking about today, which is David Gemmell's Echoes of the Great Song. Really interesting standalone book. It's kind of hard to get a reflection off that because it reflects horribly because it's covered in plastic. But the one I want to talk about, which is the one that most people have read, and it's the one that if you're going to pick up anything of Gemmell's, you definitely should start with, is Legend. Legend is really interesting. It's just a solid classic. I'm actually shocked that HBO or someone hasn't tried to make something out of Legend. So before we go into Legend in particular, as I say, it's heroic fantasy. But it's really good because it was one of the first books where the heroes are all old. And yeah, I think before we talk about this, we need to talk a bit about David Gemmell. So at the time that he wrote this, I mean, he had a very interesting career. He grew up sort of post World War II. At the time, he was abandoned by his father. He was later sort of taken on by his stepfather, bullied a lot, grew up in urban London. That whole post-World War II framework sort of shaped his experiences. He got he got a criminal record when he was 16 for running a gambling ring. He was a very interesting character. He did labor jobs, bouncer jobs, all that kind of stuff. And he later eventually blagged his way into Fleet Street and journalism, mostly with the Red Tops. But if you're not from the UK, the Red Tops are not rags, but they're more sensational newspapers, shall we say. Anyway, while he's sort of plugging away, his whole desire was to do historical fiction, not fantasy, but he was having a really hard time writing historical fiction. And then he got diagnosed with cancer, and that's where this book comes from. So his first book, when he wrote it, is after a very long life. I say very long life. He was diagnosed with cancer quite young. I forget his exact age, but he was on the older side, and he had been through all of that. It's informed by the fact that he wanted to do historical fiction. So even though it is a fantasy book, he has clearly done his research and he knows a lot about medieval combat, and his world feels very, very grounded because of that. He really knits into the details and it really makes it come to life. But the defining characteristic of the book is, as he's writing it, it's about the siege of a place called Drustolnock. And as he's writing this, he's fighting cancer, and he's literally just trying to get that one book published before he dies because, and he basically says to everyone, I'm writing two endings. One ending is if I die from cancer. One ending is if I survive. I don't know if that's PR bullshit or not, because it's so hard to tell if that's PR bullshit. It's such high-grade PR bullshit, though. I want to just give it the tick of approval. But it does mean that, and you do sense throughout the writing of the book, he doesn't know whether or not they will succeed or heroically fail. And that actually really makes all the combat in this book and makes the siege really, really interesting. So to get talking about the book, I read it originally a very long time ago, but I've reread it a few times. Even though it's widely agreed to be one of his best works, I actually prefer Echoes of the Great Song, and I want to talk about that another time. And I want to talk about Waylander, which I am finishing. But no other books of his have really grabbed me like these two. This is a start of a big series that actually gets milked quite hard, but it can be read entirely as a standalone. It was written as a standalone. So, Legend, or Druss the Legend, it's basically about not a Roman Empire, but it's about a big country that has been risen to the height of its power. It's been militarily aggressive over its history, and it's now in a sort of state of decline. And you basically have a Genghis Khan equivalent attacking from the north and worrying about wiping out this entire territory. And there's a key military point, which is called Drustelnock, and it's a very defensible position, and it's very, very workable. Another time I want to talk about especially historic and alternate history fantasy writers' obsession with battles and versus the anthropological history. Don't think that's super interesting now, because I want to focus on the book. But so this the might of the military of this nation has been drawn down. This historic fortress Drustelnock, which is always held, has been drawn down to the point where it's a shadow of its former self, and it's a victim of its own success. As a fortress, it's never been breached, so no one thinks it can be breached, so they reduce the resources it has to hold. Eventually, it's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this really old barbarian style, military fighter, and he is like in his 40s, I think, which, in a medieval setting is just like, what the hell? He's got like the arthritis and his bones are moving slow. But, historically, he's this topless, muscled monster carrying this giant axe, and he is off to go effectively die at the siege to complete his heroic legend, right? To sort of round out his story. He's basically gone there to die, which is really interesting. And then you've got a few other characters that come into play and tropes that he likes to use throughout his novels. You've got the heroic scoundrel, villain, anti-hero character. He often has a character that is historically morally compromised, as in the character's probably done some stuff they're not super fond of. In fact, most of his characters are that. As I say, that's why I think it was interesting to just mention his history as an author, because he clearly believes in redemption arcs. You have the strong female sexual character. I don't want to say whore, but might as well be. In almost every one of his books I've read, it's really bitter pill to swallow. He's awful at writing women, which is funny because he has moments where his female characters really shine, but it's difficult. And my just general description of the character there should give you an overview. And then the other major force in this is you have the 30, which are these warrior monks, warrior priests that come into it, paladins, if you will. And I find this really interesting because obviously at the time he's fighting cancer, and at the time he is facing the prospect of death. So he is thinking about death a lot when writing this book, and it really comes through. As I say, there are consequences throughout the books. Characters you think are going to survive die. This is all spoiler free. I want to stay spoiler free for this, because if you haven't read this, I desperately want you to go read this. It's just such a good book. The battles are realistic. As I say, he's clearly done his research into historic combat. And the 30, which are the only fantastical element of this book, clearly do have magic or spiritual power, and clearly do feats that are beyond the ken, as they would say. But he is always very careful never to solidify their power. If you are not them, as in, if you take everything written from the heroic priest's point of view, like as a bystander, everything is explainable. Everything they do doesn't affect the real world past information gathering. So that's probably the one thing you couldn't explain or is beyond the ken, is sometimes they have information they couldn't possibly have, which obviously in warfare is a huge advantage. But the things they tend to do spiritually are like gather information, bolster troop morale, fight these mystical battles which affect the sort of mood of the real battle. And that keeps it really grounded. As a reader, you know that no one's going to pull a fireball out their ass. There's even a section about some magic armor. And again, the armor is magic, but is it? And you're like, the uncertainty makes it interesting. And as I say, the deniability of everything fantastical in the books makes it interesting, because it also removes the certainty of any kind of afterlife, which when an author's writing close to death or with death on their mind, it's always interesting because as people and as a society, we don't like to talk about death as much. So the book really stands out for that. And yeah, I mean, as you can see, this is I can't remember I bought the secondhand if it was from a library, but I've read this so many times because it's a small chunky read you can get through, but it's yeah, it's so solid. I suppose I'll give you the back matter, and then if you guys have any questions, we'll go through it. I'll let the book sort of sell itself. The legend is Druss. The stories of his life are told everywhere. Instead of wealth and fame he could have claimed, he chose a mountain lair, high in the lonely country bordering on the clouds. There a grizzled old warrior keeps company with snow leopards and awaits his old enemy, death. The fortress is Dros Delnoch. It is the only route by which an army can pass through the mountains. Protected by 6 outer walls, it was the stronghold of the Draenei Empire. Now it is the last battleground, for all else has fallen before the Nadir hordes, and the only hope rests on the skills of that one old man. It is a very compelling read. And unless anyone has any questions, go through that. Because I don't want to dwell too long on this. I want to just sort of get this out there and sort of point people in this direction. Okay. Well, if you are watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us. This is a live show. We do it from 8:30 in the morning. Now we're going to end the recording and do some sort of post-show discussion. Ta-ta!